right, well, it's 9 o'clock, so I think we'll get started. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for being here. My name is Dr. Tricia Vesely. I am the visiting assistant professor of Hebrew Bible and Christian ethics at Memphis Theological Seminary. For the next 2 weeks, I'll be doing a series on Job, which I've titled Wisdom from Job, Giving and Receiving Comfort in Times of Suffering. So this week and next week, we'll look together at the broad question of how we might faithfully respond to one another in times of suffering, using the book of Job as a guide. As a note before we start, please feel free to use the question and answer feature to ask questions at any time during the presentation. Also, please feel free to use the chat feature to communicate with one another at any time during the presentation as well. We'll have a time for discussion at the end, but sometimes it's helpful to post your questions as they come. So go ahead and do that, and I will make sure to come back and read all of those once we get to that time at the end. All right. Well, it's not difficult to recognize that we're in the midst of very trying times for many. The coronavirus pandemic has resulted in thousands of lives lost, and for others, the loss of economic security, loved ones, health, and perhaps certain plans and dreams that have had to come to a stop or have been revised. In the midst of this, our country continues to struggle with the diseases of racial prejudice and environmental degradation. And we have an extremely polarized election around the corner. And all of that can leave us feeling very overwhelmed. I want to bring the book of Job into this discussion because it relates to many today. Job is a book about suffering. But at the same time, I will argue it's also a book about comfort. Job is considered one of the wisdom books of the Old Testament, and in spite of its somewhat pessimistic reputation, it can offer us timely wisdom on what brings comfort to those who find themselves on the ash heap of suffering like Job. Through the book, we will see both failed and successful attempts at comfort to the sufferer Job. So we will unpack those and try to discern what it is that Job seeks and what insight this might offer us in our efforts to bring comfort to others. All right. I imagine that many of you are familiar with the story of Job, but for those of you that aren't, here's a quick recap. At the opening of the book, we learn that there was a man who was upright and feared God. In fact, he is described as blameless in the opening verse. There once was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job. That man was blameless and upright, one who feared God and turned away from evil. God recognizes Job's faithfulness and boasts about him to his heavenly council. And the adversary claims that Job is only faithful because God has given him many blessings. He claims that if God were to remove those blessings, Job would no longer trust God. So we read, "The Lord said to the adversary, 'Have you considered my servant Job? There is no one like him on earth.' Then the adversary answered the Lord, 'Does Job fear God for nothing? You have blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land. But stretch out your hand now and touch all that he has, and he will curse you to your face.' The Lord said to the adversary, 'Very well, all that he has is in your power. Only spare his life.' So God allows the adversary to afflict Job with grave losses. Job loses his property, his wealth, all of his children are killed, and he is beset with terrible diseases that mar his body from head to toe. Later in the book, Job laments that in his state of suffering, he has become repulsive to the community. He sits on an ash heap, presumably on the outskirts of the community. And in chapter 19, we read that all of his kin and close friends have distanced themselves from him. Because of his sufferings, he states, "My kin are alienated from me. My acquaintances disown me. My relatives are all gone. My friends have forgotten me. My dependents and maidservants regard me as a stranger. I am an outsider to them. My odor is repulsive to my wife. I am loathsome to my children. Even young children despise me. When I rise, they speak against me. All my intimate friends abhor me, and those whom I love have turned against me." So Job is in desperate need of comfort. This is a central theme that runs throughout the book of Job. Will Job receive comfort? And if so, where will he find it? The verb in Hebrew to give or receive comfort is necham, and it's found in several crucial places throughout the book of Job. In the opening chapters, after Job's tragic losses, 3 of his friends come to comfort and console him. Chapter 2:11 says, "When Job's 3 friends heard about all these calamities that had befallen him, each of them set out from his home. They met together to go and console and comfort Naham, him." The verb Naham here is used as an infinitive expressing purpose. Their intent is to provide Job with some relief from his suffering. Several more chapters of this heated dialogue continue until Job finally, I'm sorry, I skipped a page. What we have after Job's friends come to comfort him is a long and heated dialogue. That's the part that I skipped, where Job and his friends debate such matters as God's justice, whether or not God responds to wickedness on earth, and of course, Job's innocence or his guilt. What we have in the middle of this long and heated dialogue is another instance of the verb necham. And here it's Job saying it in response to his friends. After Eliphaz says to him, "Doesn't God punish the wicked? Doesn't God remove their possessions and their progeny?" Job responds by saying this, "I have heard such things. You are all comforters of trouble. What provokes you to say such things?" And he uses the verb naham here to indicate that the comfort they give is not so much comfort as it is trouble. The use of the noun trouble in Job 16 connects Job's accusation of his friends back to his initial lament, which he speaks in chapter 3. There he says, "Perish the day on which I was born, because it did not hide trouble or amal from my eyes." And this is the same noun that Job uses to critique his friends for giving him comfort of trouble. So Job is doing 2 things here with this accusation. He's reminding his friends of their intention to come and comfort and console him. But he's also saying that instead of relieving my suffering, you have only increased my trouble. So Job is in desperate need of comfort, but it doesn't seem like his friends are doing a good job at this. All right, here's where I want to get to the awaited answer from God. So this heated dialogue continues for several more chapters, and Job finally receives a long-awaited answer from God in chapter 42. Job's response to God and this one-of-a-kind storm theophany marks another place where this verb comfort is found. Job says in 42:5 and 6, "I have spoken without understanding of things beyond me that I did not know. I had heard of you with my ears, but now I see you with my eyes. Therefore I recant and nahamti on dust and ashes." Now, most translators render the verb naham here as repent, and this is likely what you'll find in your English Bibles. But there's a good case to be made that Job is continuing the use of the meaning to give or receive comfort for this verb, acknowledging that he has been comforted in some way by this encounter with God. We're going to talk about this verse more next week, but it's noteworthy that here the verb naham is in what is something called the perfect in Hebrew. And this doesn't express intention or purpose, rather it expresses a completed action or a state of being. So it seems that Job has found comfort in the midst of his suffering through this encounter with God, at least in part. The last place that the verb naham shows up in the book of Job is in the closing scenes in the epilogue. After Job's encounter with God, he is returned to the community, and we read that Job's family and former friends come and comfort and console him. Job 42:11 reads, "All of his brothers and sisters and all of his former friends came to him and had a meal with him in his house. They consoled and comforted him for all of the misfortune that the Lord had brought upon him." Here, as well as in the last instance, the verb naham is in the perfect form, indicating not purpose, but a completed action. And so the theme of comfort has come full circle in the book of Job. There are two other places where this verb shows up, and I'll mention another one next week. But I'm going to focus on these four places primarily, which we can trace Job's search for comfort through. As I mentioned, we'll talk more about God's answer to Job next week, but what I want to look at this week is Job's relationship with his friends. Why did his friends fail in their efforts to comfort and console Job? What specifically was Job seeking from them? You know, that God can provide comfort is probably not too surprising for us, although in the book of Job, what it is specifically about God's responses that causes Job to respond with comfort is certainly debatable. But Job has a real human need for comfort as well, and he seeks this from his human companions in the book. So the question, focusing on Job's exchange with his friends, is how can we, on a human level, offer comfort that heals and that might truly bring relief to those who suffer? I want to start to address this question by pointing out that many readers of Job judge the antagonism between Job and his friends based on the content of their speeches. They don't agree on certain theological principles, that is. So the question often brought to the text is, who is saying something that is true or false? Who has the right doctrine about God and God's ways with respect to humanity? And with respect to Job's guilt or innocence specifically. There is something to this notion, of course. Job wants his friends to declare that he is not guilty and that suffering does not always mean that God is punishing a person for wrongdoing. But there's much more to the question of comfort than this in the language of Job. This is a wisdom book, and one might say that right knowledge is a component of wisdom. But in the Hebrew Bible, wisdom is an embodied reality. It must be lived out. It's not just about knowing and saying the right things. Job is not simply seeking intellectual assent or agreement from his friends. His critiques of his friends and his pleas that they would respond in certain ways reveal that his search for comfort includes more than right words. The first friend who offers a response to Job after Job's lament in chapter 3 is Eliphaz. In chapters 4 and 5, Eliphaz tries to encourage Job with the counsel that God does not target those who are upright, but only the wicked. He instructs Job to tone down his speech a bit, to return to God, to accept God's discipline of him, and to submit Then he will find peace, he says. It's telling that when Job responds to Eliphaz in turn, his first response is not to debate Eliphaz's theology. Instead, he opens his mouth with another outcry of suffering. He continues to express his anguish and his pain. Oh, that my anguish were weighed, all my calamity laid on the scales. It would be heavier than the sand of the sea, he says. Job then laments that he has no resources upon which to stand. He is truly helpless. What strength do I have? Is my strength the strength of rock? He asks. Truly, there is no help within me. I have been deprived of my resourcefulness. Job's next words contain a plea for his friends to help him. And in that plea, we see one of Job's expectations or desires in his search for comfort. In 6:14, Job states, "A friend owes Hesed to one who is failing, even though he forsakes the fear of the Almighty." It's also worth noting here that when Job reflects on his own helplessness and his strained relationship to God, his first thoughts turn towards his human companions. Now, this term Hesed is a very familiar concept in the Hebrew Bible. It's used to express a deep and abiding loyalty between two parties. The concept is variously translated as faithfulness, compassionate loyalty, loving kindness, steadfastness, solidarity. And it connects with relational images in the Bible, not least of all in God's covenantal relationship with Israel. Yet such loyalty may also be expressed between two human parties as well. Hesed involves a commitment to another person, a willingness to remain loyal through both times of prosperity and trouble. Job has just lost everything of value to him, his material wealth, his children, his reputation, and his health. And he seeks some indication that his friends stand in solidarity with him, that they have not severed their relationship in his current state of misery, even though his faith in God is faltering. In the following verses, Job further clarifies what this kind of commitment looks like, and he does this through an extended metaphor. A lack of Hesed is like a dried up riverbed, he says. He complains that his friends are fickle and inconsistent, like a wadi in the desert. In the winter, snow and ice offer the promise of replenishing water, yet when water is most needed during times of heat and drought, the riverbed runs dry. The result for those who come to the wadi hoping for nourishment is physical languishment and shame, Job complains. This is powerful imagery. Job, in essence, is saying that a response of loyalty and solidarity, Hesed, would be like life-giving water that could provide nourishment in his desert landscape of suffering. Unfortunately, as Job says in 6:20, springs of water in a desert and a demonstration of Hesed are all too often nowhere to be found in times of drought. This leaves Job in a position where he is hopeless, helpless, and homeless. As I noted at the start of this lecture, Job repeatedly describes his present sufferings in terms of social alienation. In Job 19, Job catalogs this list of broken relationships. My kin are alienated from me, my acquaintances disown me, etc. All of those who once ensured Job's central place in the community have severed their bonds with him. Job is now an object of shame to the entire community. He is removed both physically and emotionally from the community's space. Along with the show of Hesed, then, Job is in desperate need of the gift of hospitality. Hospitality may be defined as a demonstration of gifts of place. And these can be physical gifts such as shelter, food, drink, clothing, or other resources. Or these can be internal and relational gifts, offering one a space or a place in one's inner landscape, an acceptance, a welcoming, and a valuing of another person as they are. A demonstration of hospitality has its foundations in how one perceives the world and others within the world. Job's alienation from society is, in one sense, physical and external. He sits on an ash heap on the outskirts of the community. But it is also internal. It includes this internal kind of cutting off by those close to him. Job's so-called friends may have entered his physical space, but they do not want to give him a place in their internal worlds, not as he claims himself to be, an innocent sufferer. They will not let his presence affect their perceptions of the world. Job is therefore experiencing a displacement. He has no home in the external or internal worlds of those who surround him. His friends cannot, or perhaps they refuse to, make a place in their minds for someone who is suffering at no due cause. No such thing exists in their minds. Therefore, they must keep Job at arm's length or distort the truth about him, so that for them, Job becomes as they need him to be. And we see this later in Job chapter 22, where Eliphaz starts naming a list of sins that Job must have committed. So Job can only fit into the friends' worlds as the worst kind of sinners. His welcome back into the community may only come through confession and repentance. But this would compromise Job's integrity and personhood, however. For Job to find a place in their worlds, he must become less than what he is. Job, therefore, is in dire need of a show of hospitality from those around him, a recognition, an acceptance, and a welcoming of his true self. A show of hospitality and solidarity from his friends would serve as a bridge, overcoming his shame and physical languishment that he's experiencing by inviting him back into the folds of the community again. Along with Hesed and hospitality, Job also seeks courage, or what I'm calling courageous compassion, in his search for comfort. With the metaphor of the wadi, Job faults his friends for leaving him alone in his suffering. He concludes his metaphorical depiction with this complaint. "So you are as nothing," he says, referring to their incapacity to provide any waters of consolation. "You see a horror and you take fright." The kind of fear that Job faults the friends for displaying is not the same kind of fear of God that is attributed to Job in the prologue, an indication of his piety. The fear that Job's friends display is what many psychologists will describe as a movement of avoidance. It is a movement away from another, and it reveals a devaluation of another. The horror in question here is none other than Job. Perhaps it's his suffering, or perhaps it is what he represents to the friends. The friends' fear betrays a deep distrust for Job and for the outside world. Their fear demonstrates their unwillingness to venture beyond the boundaries of what is certain, comfortable, and secure. So they flee in fright rather than confront the possibility that innocent beings may undergo horrific suffering at no fault of their own. Fear and the withholding of hospitality and solidarity go hand in hand. A person moves away from what is terrifying. The virtues of hospitality and solidarity require openness and a willingness to move closer to another. Job seeks someone who will courageously confront what may seem inexplicable, unsettling, and even dangerous for the sake of compassion, hospitality, and solidarity. Unfortunately for Job, his friends do not provide him with this. Had the friends demonstrated courageous compassion, solidarity, and hospitality, Job may have found some level of comfort in his sufferings. These gifts would at least have communicated Job's value from the friends' perspectives, and they would have contributed to Job's restoration of honor and his place in the community. As I mentioned earlier, often readers of this biblical book critique the friends' attempts at comforting Job based on the content of their speeches. They offer Job false doctrine, supposedly. And as I said, this may have been part of the problem, but the friends say many things that sound right and that align with other biblical traditions. They praise God's marvelous design for creation, for example. They remind Job that God is just. They encourage Job that if he return to God and submit to God's discipline, he will find restoration. And they remind Job that God's ways are beyond human comprehension. And several commentators, in fact, argue that the friends are acting as God's spokespersons, and that Job is, in fact, a sinner who needs to repent. The friends speak many pious words. And yet, in the epilogue, God condemns the friends. We read in chapter 42:7, "And the Lord said to Eliphaz the Temanite, 'My wrath is kindled against you and your two friends, for you have not spoken rightly about me, as my servant Job has.'" God is angry with the friends and requires them to offer a sacrifice. God does not seem happy with the friends' pious words then, even though they seem to be advocating for God. Both God's and Job's responses suggest that our responsibility to those who suffer may not centrally be about providing the right doctrine, or at the very least, that may not be enough. I want to go back to chapter 6, to Job's response to Eliphaz there to further demonstrate this. Near the end of chapter 6, after Job has described his friends as a dried up riverbed and complained that they flee from him in terror, he says to them, "Face me, for I will not lie to your faces." English translations often use the word "turn and look at me," but the Hebrew is literally the verb to face, from the same root as the noun face, which Job uses in the second half of this sentence. Why is Job's entreaty that his friends face him so important in his state of alienation and suffering? I'm going to suggest that more than right words spoken from a safe distance, Job is asking that his friends enter into his situation in an embodied, concrete way. And the language of facing another communicates this. It's as if Job is saying, "Look me in the eyes, look at my physical, corporeal body, and let that affect your perceptions and your responses to me." Words of comfort, a demonstration of solidarity, hospitality, and courage demands this kind of entering into the space of another. Right words must be spoken from a place of genuine relationality. It's interesting that Job's cries of frustration to his friends include these words. He doesn't say at the start, "Admit you are wrong and that I am right," or that I am innocent. He says, in effect, "Turn and look at me. Come into my space." Instead of being placed in one category or another of humanity, in the friends' ordered understandings of the world, Job asks to be treated like a person rather than a proposition. So I'm going to suggest that what Job is asking for is a basic stance whereby we are what Dietrich Bonhoeffer calls incarnationally present to another. And the Jewish philosopher Emmanuel Levinas writes about this in terms of an ethics of the face. Levinas underscores that our most basic, our most fundamental ethical response to another exists in a face-to-face encounter with that person. This basic stance undercuts all theory, all doctrine, and all philosophy. It shatters all of our previously held conceptions about another, the world, and God, and makes us morally accountable to that other. Bonhoeffer writes that this kind of being present to another acknowledges the full humanity of another and makes us more fully human in the process. Job is lacking this kind of embodied face-to-face encounter from his friends. Their fear keeps them at a distance. As he states in 628, what we just read, if they were willing to step into his space and respond to him as a unique person, the truth of his situation would be made plain. So Job needs this kind of response from his friends, and we all need this, especially those who suffer. It's no small thing that God's act of reconciliation with the world comes in the form of God's embodied word in the person of Jesus Christ. It is this concrete, lived out reality, the incarnation, that brings healing and comfort to a broken world. Through the incarnation, God enters into our situation in a real, concrete way, offering us the gifts of solidarity, courageous compassion, and hospitality, a place in the love and relationality of God and with one another in God's world. It is God's embodied word that brings about the transformation and healing of our brokenness and suffering. As Job's case suggests, though, we as human beings are called to participate in embodied acts of healing and comfort as well, if we are willing to leave behind the safe confines of our ordered understandings of the world and enter into the lives of those who suffer, offering them solidarity, hospitality, and courageous compassion. Bonhoeffer looks to Jesus Christ as the model of this kind of genuine relationality. It is the historical incarnate Christ that enables us to encounter others in true community. In his own life, Jesus drew near to those who were suffering. He walked with, ate with, conversed with, and allowed himself to be affected by others. He suffered with and for us. For Bonhoeffer, in Christ, we can overcome our fear and our tendency to live in abstractions and enter into the world in an immediate and concrete way. For Levinas, it is also the presence of God in another that brings us to this level of relationality. It is the face of God in another that enables us to break free from our tendencies to totalize another, to capture them in our theories and ordered dogma. Both of these philosophers and Job, I think, recognize that true healing of our relationships and our suffering and brokenness takes place in the context of this kind of embodied togetherness. What this means for us in the present world is something that we need to talk about. And I'm going to ask this again next week. And perhaps it's something that we can begin to talk about here as well. Let me pause for a moment and give you a chance to offer questions or comments. I have a few questions of my own, but I'd like to let you share your questions first. While you're thinking about your questions, I'll give a brief summary of what we've discussed so far. We've talked about the theme of comfort in Job and focused on the first two aspects of that theme in the book, which includes Job's friends' attempts to comfort Job and Job's response that their efforts didn't bring comfort, but only more trouble for him. I argued that Job's words suggest that Job is not after intellectual agreement, not primarily at least, but he seeks persons who will step into his space and regard him as a person rather than a proposition, who will offer the gifts of solidarity, hospitality, and courageous compassion. And we saw this through the idea of a relation of facing or being incarnationally present to another through the philosophies and ethics of Dietrich Bonhoeffer and Emmanuel Levinas. So let me pause there. I'm going to see if I can figure out how to find questions. Okay, I have a question about the Hesed, the meaning of Hesed, and I'm going to go back to that slide. So the question is, could you show the meaning of Hesed again, going back to that slide when you have a chance? All right, so let's see if I can go backwards. This is, Hesed is one of the most theologically rich Hebrew words in the Hebrew Bible. It's hard to capture in English because it's not just a feeling. Hebrew is very much, like I've been trying to stress, a language that captures the physicality of the way we interact with one another. So there's both this physicality and an action sense, as well as a commitment and a loyalty. Generally, you'll get translations like, sometimes folks will say covenantal faithfulness, or steadfastness, or abiding love, solidarity. All of those together, I think, capture what Hesed means. It's a deep commitment that is enacted in the way we live out our lives with one another. My dog is making noises in his sleep, and I guess he agrees. Does that answer your question? Okay, I see some chats going on here. Let's see if I can figure this out. All right. Let's see. All right, here's some chat. Okay. Okay, the question or comment is about Jesus's quotation of Psalm 22, which is, my God, why have you forsaken me? Jesus is quoting Psalm 22 in the Aramaic there. Maybe this is a big question. Often discussions of this passage, and I think you all can read this if you're all accessible to chat. Often discussions of this passage consist of working out atonement theologies, or even a theology of the Trinity, and miss what is right in front of us in the text, a person feeling abandoned by God. Why are we so prone to do this, and how can we begin to read the Bible differently? So I think missing what is right in front of us in the text, a person feeling abandoned by God. Are you suggesting that what we miss is the real experiential nature of suffering? I don't know if you're able to respond to that in chat. I can make a general comment to that. I do think there's a tendency in, that's what is meant. I do think there's a tendency in certain Christian theologies to spiritualize our relationship with God to the point where it's something that we compartmentalize. What is my spiritual well-being? We separate that from our physical beings. We think about salvation in terms of, something otherworldly or transcendent. We don't always think of it coming into our real embodied lives. This is something that I try to get across in my ethics classes. And it might just be our Western tendency. We've come from a long tradition that has set body and soul against each other. And unfortunately, the way we express our religion, sometimes we see that. One of the things that the Hebrew Bible is nice is that it brings us back to the very corporeal and physical sense of what faith is about. It's about our real struggles and our real suffering and how God can answer that. That doesn't mean that God has to take away our pain, but it's okay to bring God into that level of our lives. Why else would our faith be meaningful? When we speak about the transformation of the world, we're not just talking about kind of a feeling, feeling good or some kind of otherworldly reality. How can we begin to read the Bible differently? That's a great question. I guess we can start asking the hard questions and start thinking about, what it means to be suffering in relationship to God, and not let these kinds of hard questions be seen as a sign of weakness or a sign that we lack faith. Job is elevated as, a hero of the faith, and he is one of the most contentious biblical figures that you'll ever read about. This idea that Job was patient and submissive gets thrown around, but that's not the Job of the Hebrew Bible. Just read past chapter 2 and you'll find a very different Job who is struggling and crying out in very real ways. And I think we as, in our faith communities need to welcome that, need to make a space for it. Did that somewhat get at your question about, yes, okay. I think it's because we think due to ignorance, because we believe, I'm reading this response, because we believe in God, everything is supposed to go perfect, when the Bible shows that that's not the case. Even people who God favored went through suffering. Amen to that. Let me ask, let me just check to make sure I didn't miss another question. Okay, yes, let me answer this question. Isn't it natural for people to try to make sense of the situation? Yes. If we enter into solidarity with the person's pain, how do we suspend the need to figure out why a person is experiencing pain? Yes, that is our tendency. We want to solve problems. I think that's a very natural human tendency, and it's not that I think we should stop trying to want to solve problems. Maybe this is just a lesson for us to think about what it means to solve problems instead of thinking of a solution as an intellectual solution. Maybe a solution is a more existential, on the ground kind of standing with type of solution. I'll stress this again, in the Hebrew Bible, having the right words, we're going to talk about this more next week. So hopefully if you're here next week, we'll fill this out more. Having the right words is not enough. Wisdom is not kind of being able to speak the right doctrine. And again, this is our Western history has pushed us in this direction, that it's all about doctrine. In the Hebrew Bible, wisdom is something that is lived out and enacted. And sometimes that might mean not having words at all. Sometimes that might mean silence, but being there with another person side by side. Let me pose a question to you all, if I may, and this kind of ties on what you just asked about how it is we can stand with someone in solidarity. Job and his friends, I focused on the fear that Job's friends seem to display and what Job critiques them for. And I think, we can say that yes, fear can keep us from getting too close to other people in their suffering. But that's not the only thing that keeps us from entering into another person's space. So I just want to ask you all to maybe share your thoughts. What else keeps us from entering into another person's space who is suffering? What else beyond fear? I'm looking for any ideas. I'll throw one out there. I think sometimes it's our pride. I think sometimes it's a sense of self-righteousness. Sometimes I think acknowledging that something is happening with another person would take us out of, our sort of sense of being righteous about the way we understand and control the world. So I think part of it is a bit of pride. We don't want to be seen as one who is broken or who relates with others who are broken. We want to keep this kind of pristine image up about ourselves. I also think that apathy is a problem. It takes effort to go into other people's lives and struggles. We're comfortable, especially in a world of social distancing, and we're going to talk next week about this era of, the pandemic. We have to kind of pick ourselves up and get out of our comfort zone, and I think that's hard for us to do. So I think there's more than just fear that contributes to keeping people out of this real kind of incarnational presence. To live in what Bonhoeffer's talking about with being incarnationally present, it takes a vulnerability. We kind of like to respond with formulas and how we go about our lives. I mean, it's easy, we just kind of program ourselves. But it takes an openness and a vulnerability for the moment to shape us, to be open to the moment. And that means to go into something not knowing the right answers all the time. And that can take a lifelong struggle to really, I don't know that we ever master it, but just to get ourselves more and more into that place where we are living present with and for others. Any other questions or comments about that? All right, let me ask another question. Am I missing anything? Here's another question then for you. I hope you have some thoughts. If not, we'll keep moving. I focused on the virtues or dispositions of solidarity, hospitality, and courage as three kind of necessary responses that Job is seeking, at least in this part of the dialogue, from his friends. What else do you think would bring comfort to those who are suffering? There are other kinds of responses. If you think about maybe those in your own lives, and I don't know if you think about it in terms of dispositions, and I have a background in virtue ethics, which is why I tend to like to focus on this. The physical needs are tied to those dispositions. Hospitality is both a disposition and an outward display of that disposition. But perhaps there are other responses: humility, honesty, and openness is a kind of disposition, I think, of vulnerability in a good way, not being, keeping our wisdom, but being open to others in the present moment. All right. We're all drinking our coffee this morning. Let me, if you all are happy with me talking, by all means, please interrupt and ask questions. Since I have time, I do want to say one more thing. I'm going to go back to the summary slide. Oh, did I miss it? Oh my gosh, there's all kinds of new messages. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry, y'all. I was wondering why you were all so quiet. We risk vulnerability. Yes, Heather, having to be vulnerable. Exactly. Apathy is key. I'm having a hard time. I'm going to open this chat so I can see it. Ignorance, that we said that. Being personally exhausted, that's a good one, Nathan. Yes, we're tired. We're tired, and not taking care of ourselves and our own struggles can keep us from others. Simply not wanting to help, I think, from Keenan, or thinking we're incapable of helping. That's a good one too. Not trusting in our own capacities to be comforters. That's a very good one. And exactly, Professor Hudson, with COVID-19, it's our own vulnerability that makes us having to weigh the benefits versus the costs. Yes, what do we do in this age where we can't be physically present with another? Definitely. Feeling like someone is the cause of their suffering. Oh, so they deserve, okay, so that's kind of like the Job situation. Sometimes folks, unfortunately, we do see this if we're, watching politics, that sometimes great disasters are read as, God's punishment. And for some folks, that is unfortunately the response that they give and why they don't respond. Compassion is another, what would, keeping a sense of humor, that's great. All great responses. Thank you for that. And I'm sorry I didn't see those. I'm still trying to work out the Zoom, master the Zoom. All right, I'm going to come back here. I have, I think, 10 minutes, 9 minutes, and I'm going to just say one more thing. I want to say one more thing about the effect of the antagonism between Job and his friends on readers. We often think about how unfortunate it is for Job that his friends failed to comfort him. But there is an underlying rhetorical effect at work in this, I think. There's a void that's created in the text, and this void, created by the failure of Job's friends, leaves us as readers wondering who is going to step in and comfort Job. It elicits a desire in us to want to alleviate the situation. And I think in this way, the book invites us to respond to others in ways that would meet the needs of those who are suffering. So this gap provided by Job's friends with respect to compassion, solidarity, courage, and hospitality pulls us in, and it helps to elicit or cultivate these kinds of dispositions in ourselves as readers. If we're sympathetic readers, we want to fill that emotional void. We want to defend Job and we want to advocate for this sufferer. And this may be one of the overall aims of the book. We can't ever go back and ask the author, but there's a lot of rhetorical tools that seem to push this direction. The book doesn't only invite us to think more deeply about suffering and God's role in innocent suffering, but there's a persuasive and an ethical component at work. It invites us to become like those who might respond to Job and others who suffer seemingly needlessly with compassion, solidarity, courage, and hospitality. So next week, we're going to look at the other two places where the theme of comfort comes up in Job that I mentioned. And we're going to look at these two places where it appears that Job has proclaimed that he has received comfort, and we'll unpack those. So the encounter between God and Job will be discussed, and also Job's return to the community. And I'm also going to end next week by asking us to think about what this means for us today in a COVID-19 world. How can we creatively respond to others in an embodied, concrete way? I put up some suggestions for further reading, and I'll put these up next week as well. The material from this week is drawn from what I wrote in Friendship and Virtue Ethics on the Book of Job. In that book, I talk about these three responses: Hesed, or solidarity, hospitality, and courageous compassion. But I also go over, I think there's a total of 7 different virtues that I talk about. So if you're interested in that, learning more about Job's expectations from his friends and what kinds of responses he's looking for in his suffering, you'll find that there. The other 2 resources I have up here are going to tie in more next week. The biblical scholar William Brown has done a lot with Job's response to God in chapter 42, where Job says, "I am comforted." We'll talk about that. And he's written a lot about what it is within the divine speeches that brings comfort to Job. So you'll find that in an essay that he has called Job and the Comforting Chaos in Seeking Wisdom's Depths and Torah's Heights, an edited volume. and also in his book, The 7 Pillars of Creation. I'm going to do one last check to see if I missed any other. It looks like we're good as far as questions. I apologize if I missed anyone's comments. Thank you all for responding with such fruitful conversation. All right, so I'm going to end there, and thank you for joining today. I hope you have a great week, and I hope that I will see you back next week. Bye-bye.